I'm very excited to welcome you today to the conference, Encountering Difference, Embodying Boundaries, Unsettling Borders, Middle Eastern Refugees and Immigrants in the European Union. Today is our fifth and final session of the conference, but we will continue to be in touch and to share research and ideas after this conference ends as well. And today, one of our goals is to connect Europe to also North Carolina. And so we are also featuring people who do a lot of work in this area in North Carolina as well. So that's very exciting to make those local connections to where we are. My name is Banu Gökarıksel, and I'm Professor of Geography and the Royster Distinguished Professor for Graduate Education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'm welcoming you on behalf of our team of organizers that include Devran Koray Öçal, Lily Herbert, Betül Aykaç, Suat Jaber, who are all at University of North Carolina in the Geography Department in Chapel Hill, and Nathan Swanson, who used to be in Chapel Hill, but who has now earned his degree and is now at Purdue Honors College, Purdue University Honors College. So it's nice to actually reconnect with him through this conference as well. I want to acknowledge the support of our sponsors, primarily the Center for European Studies, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, and Katie Linder is here. So thank you, Katie, for supporting this conference, making it possible. And there's a survey that we'd like everyone to fill out. And it has two parts. One is at the beginning of the conference or the session, and one is to be at the end, very short, very straightforward. So I'll just see if I can actually attach the survey. I'm not able to. Okay, let me see. So you can do it while you listen to me acknowledge our other sponsors as well. I'd also like to thank UNC Global Research Institute, the College of Arts and Sciences, UNC Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies, and our home department, Department of Geography at UNC. This roundtable is called Learning, Teaching, and Community Building with Refugees. Our goal today is to bring together scholars, activists, students, and NGO workers to discuss how to learn from and with refugees, teach about refugees, and engage with refugee communities. What are the strategies for resisting the racialization and marginalization of refugees and for developing an appreciation of refugee experiences, knowledge, and contributions to societies? What interventions in research, in the classroom, and in community organizing are required to promote ethical engagements with refugees and to maximize benefits flowing from these engagements to refugees and their communities? These are the broad questions that we pose to our panelists, whom each one actually brings a really unique experience. So we'll come back to some of these questions in the discussion after they speak as well. So we have 5 speakers. Each person will speak about 8 minutes, and we'll have time for discussion after their presentations. During this event, we encourage you to tweet using tag @UnsettledBorders and hashtag EU@UNC for this event. And we'll start with Dr. Christian Wilhelm, and I'll introduce him, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. So Dr. Christian Wilhelm is the manager of the International Master Programs of the Department of Social Sciences at Humboldt University in Berlin. During the so-called refugee crisis in 2015, he initiated the opening of the German-Turkish GET MA program for refugees. This created a unique opportunity for refugees to access the German university system. In addition to the opening of the program, he developed additional support services for refugee students and linked the project with other initiatives of the university. And I'm also happy to say that Christian is affiliated with the Center for European Studies at UNC and visits our campus every year. So it's really wonderful to have him involved and here to speak for our conference as well. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you for the introduction. Actually, it's without a doctor. I'm just working at the university.
That's
but it's
okay.
no problem.
Seems like you deserve it.
Yeah. So hello and good evening. I think it seems to be a really good evening tonight, at least here in Berlin, and you're waiting for a good evening, hopefully. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to share my experience in working with refugees. So as already said, so I manage the international master programs here at the Department of Social Sciences at Humboldt University. At the time of the so-called refugee crisis, so 5 years ago, when our Chancellor, Ms. Merkel, had said, we can do it. So this is the German version of yes, we can. My colleagues and I had thought about what we could do to make it easier for people to arrive in Germany. So we quickly realized that one problem for refugees in Germany is to get access to the higher education system. So to study at a German university, you have to prove that you have a very, very good knowledge of German. So that means you have to prove C1 level for German. This is very hard to reach. I mean, that makes total sense in a normal study program. However, you have to prove your German language skills even for programs taught only in English, such as engineering or IT studies, stuff like this. And that makes less sense. So we, as the international master programs, had a special position with our English taught GETMA program, the German-Turkish Master's Program in Social Sciences, because for this program, no German language skills are required. And since we are an international program, so the normal regulations for regular German study programs don't apply. So we had a special position. And this program, so the general structure is it's a 2-year master's program, and it's a cooperation with the Middle East Technical University in Ankara in Turkey, and also with UNC. So the normal track with Ankara means that the students start their studies in Ankara, study there for 1 year. And after this year, the first year, the students come to Berlin, continue their studies, and get a degree from Humboldt. So it's also the GETMA US track with UNC. So that means the students start at UNC and then they join after 1 semester the group in Ankara, and then they come to Berlin. So this is the special structure of this program. So we thought we could take advantage of this fact that the students don't have to be there in Berlin the first year and don't have to prove their German skills. So we thought, maybe we have a chance to open it or to restructure it for refugees. And our idea was that we wanted to simply mirror the first year in Ankara, in Berlin, and offer courses, special courses with the similar teaching content of the courses in Ankara, so that they don't have to go to Ankara to make the first year, so that they have the chance to make the first year in Berlin. So actually, this is a very simple idea to open the program and to mirror the courses. At least we thought so, but we soon had to realize that other players at our university did not find this so easy and kept causing us problems. So it was a bit problematic to convince them that it's a useful thing to integrate people. And this took nearly half a year to convince them, and somehow we had to intrigue as well. But what I've learned is that if you want something, you always find a way to reach it, or at least most of the time you find something. And if you don't want something, you find reasons why it doesn't work. And that was the experience we had. So somebody built a wall and we realized, okay, we have to walk around the wall, find a new way to reach our aim, and we were successful. And also political support is very important during this process to get something done at the university. And we were very lucky that we got a new vice president for internationalization, and she supported us, our project. To open our GETMA program does not mean that every refugee without a suitable academic qualification was simply accepted into the program. So no, it means like everyone else, they had to go through the same selection process with applications and also interviews and present all the certificates. But we took into account their particular situation. For example, that certificates or diplomas were not immediately available for them, or letters of recommendation were harder to obtain from them. So, I mean, if you flew Syria, so it's very hard to ask your professor to write a letter for recommendation. But in general, it was a selection of the best in the first cohort. And our main motivation was not pity for the poor refugees, but rather an understanding of fairness. So we somehow wanted to create equal opportunities for them, or at least a chance to study at all at the German university. In general, we wanted to treat our students with a refugee background as normal as possible, and thus give them back a little bit of normality as far as possible in their case. Of course, it's not always possible, but at least it's worth a try. We now have over 40 students with a refugee background, so in 3-4 cohorts, and who study together with our other international and German students. So we try to treat them as normal international students and not like refugee students. At the beginning, we called this new track the GETMA refugee track, but very quickly we realized they don't like it very much to treat it special. So we said, okay, we have a GETMA Ankara track, we have a GETMA US track, and now we have a GETMA Berlin track, which is only open for refugees. And sometimes we use this refugee label if we wanted to reach something in politics or in our administration, because it's much easier to say, this is the refugee track, we need some support. And it's easier to get support if you use the term refugee instead of just the Berlin track. So most of our students, they come from Syria. So we have 16 students from Syria, 10 from Afghanistan, and 7 from Turkey. And this is a bit funny. So we have 7 refugee students from Turkey, and we have more normal students from Turkey. And so they mix here in Berlin at the first time. But we also have a few students from Iraq, Tanzania, Somalia, and Egypt. All in all, this new group of students is an enrichment for the entire GETMA program, as they bring completely different experiences and perspectives to the classes. For example, democratization or democracy, they have a different understanding if they come from Syria than if they come from the US. And this is also in line with our general approach for our international master programs, since we try to learn and to do research together instead of just learning and researching about each other. And so this new group with the refugees is really, really an enrichment for us. And yes, that was the start. And after we had enrolled the students, we also found out that we were apparently the first ones in Germany, the first university in Germany who enrolled refugees. There were other activities going on university level, but they were usually special courses taught in Arabic or in Farsi, especially for refugees, but they didn't count for anything. So there were just offers. They could go to university, but it wasn't a program. They couldn't reach a degree and so on. And we thought that's not what we want. We want to give them a real chance to get integrated in the German system and get a degree, and afterwards to have a chance to integrate into society. But since we were the first ones, that meant that nobody knew how to deal with students with a refugee background. So not in the health insurance, they didn't know how to work with them. The BAföG office, so BAföG, that's the German state funding for students. So when they applied for it, they said, how do we handle them? Can we give them money? And yeah, these were the problems we had to solve. And when we started the whole thing, we had very low expectations. So I always said that if we could get more than 10 qualified applications, and if we were able to register 5 of them in the program, and if one of them would graduate, it would be worth it. And in the meantime, it has been more than fulfilled. So very few of our students with refugee history will complete their studies in the standard duration of study, since they have different problems than other students, but we are proud that almost all of them are still in the program. And those who have already graduated are also doing quite well on the job market. So for example, one graduate got a job in the state administration of Brandenburg, that's next to Berlin, right after her graduation. And I'm particularly proud of that. This year, however, we have not accepted any new students, mainly for 2 reasons. Firstly, under Corona conditions, for example, with online teaching and without personal supervision of the students, we could not do our job well and would not be successful, since they need more support than other students. And secondly, during the last 2 years, there were less and less qualified applications. And we think that this is due to the fact that most of the refugees are no longer dependent on special programs, since the refugees who came 5 years ago, they're now able to speak German on the C1 level and can apply for normal programs. And this is very good, and we don't want to artificially extend our program without need. Okay, that's it from my side, and thank you very much for listening. And I'll be happy to answer any questions right now or afterwards in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Christian, for telling us about this this new program that you and your colleagues created at Humboldt University. I did a little bit of like work in Germany with Chiron, this organization that that helps online refugee youth access higher education online. So during that process, I learned how much of a barrier language is in German universities. So this is really important work that you did actually there, and it's really encouraging to hear about it. I'll introduce the next speaker, and if you have any questions for Christian, please save it to the end, and we'll have more of a time for discussion and asking questions as well. Thank you. So our next speaker is Diya Abdo, who is the director of UNCG's Center for New North Carolinians. Dr. Abdo is a second-generation Palestinian refugee who was born and raised in Jordan. And her teaching, research, and scholarship focus on Arab women writers and Arab and Islamic feminisms. She has also published poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. Her public essays focus on the intersection of gender, political identity, and vocation. In 2015, Dr. Abdo founded the Every Campus a Refuge initiative, which advocates for housing refugee families on college and university campus grounds and assisting them in resettlement. The flagship chapter at Guilford College now has hosted, now one of several of the Every Campus a Refuge campuses, has hosted 60 refugees so far, 29 of them children from Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Venezuela, and Colombia. Dr. Abdo is the recipient of Campus Compact and Brown University's Swearer Center's 2019 Thomas Ehrlich Civically Engaged Faculty Award. She was named a finalist in the Arab Hope Makers Award in 2018 and received the Gulf South Summit's 2017 Outstanding Service Learning Collaboration in Higher Education Award and the Washington Center's 2017 Civic Engagement in Higher Education Award. Thanks a lot, Diya, Dr. Abdo, for joining us.
Thanks, Banu. Thank you all for having me. So I'm going to talk about my program, Every Campus a Refuge. And like Christian, I think we were all mobilized in 2015 by the Syrian civil war, but really by Elon Kurdi's image, that little boy who drowned. And Every Campus a Refuge was inspired by the Pope's call at the time to for every parish in Europe to host a refugee family. And a simple thought occurred to me that colleges and universities are exactly like parishes. We're small cities with all the resources necessary to host a refugee family on our grounds and support them in their resettlement. So Every Campus a Refuge was born then in 2015. This is a group of us coming together to represent this idea of radical hospitality, right? What the Pope wanted at the time, this sort of embracing the stranger, the other, opening up our spaces to refugee families seeking safety elsewhere. So at its core, really Every Campus a Refuge is reimagining how we're using our spaces and how we're using our resources. And in this particular case, it's campus resources and spaces to assist refugees who are coming into Greensboro. For folks who don't know, North Carolina is second to New York in refugee resettlement on the eastern seaboard in the United States. And Greensboro especially has been resettling refugees for over 40 years. We're a significant refugee resettlement hub in North Carolina. So we started in January of 2016. I went into the president's office at the time and said, I'd like a house on our campus to host refugees. And she said, yes. And so we've been hosting refugees for 5 years now. We've used that one house consistently, but we also use other spaces as they become available. So we remain flexible and nimble in this effort and make sure that we keep our eye out for resources that can be shared and utilized in this way. Since 2016, January 2016, we've hosted 60 folks on our campus. 29 of them have been children. Right before the shutdown in March, we hosted a newly arriving family from Venezuela and Colombia, a family of 5, and they're still on our campus, hoping to move off campus very soon. The families that we've hosted have been as large as 11 or 9 members and single cases as well. And they stay in a variety of places on our campus, but all of those places are in accordance with the standards of our refugee resettlement agency partner. So they're discrete apartments, discrete houses. The folks that we host on our campus don't share bathrooms or kitchens with students, for example. They have their own discrete spaces. Folks stay on our campus between 3 months and 8 months, but they average 5 months. And we support them with a cadre of trained and vetted volunteers, over 100, depending on who's with us that semester, but many staff and faculty who have been with us for 5 years as volunteers. And we do everything, airport welcome, setting up of the house, providing furniture, supporting with case management. And then when families are ready to move off our campus after they've found employment and have settled on their feet, we support them with their first month's pay, their first month's rent and utilities, etc. These are some pictures of families that we've hosted. They have been taken with consent and shared with consent. This is Marwa, Ahmed, Yusuf, and Aboudi. They've since had, Marwa since had her newest baby, Adam. And they were the Iraqi family that we hosted. This is Blaise. Blaise is from Burundi. He is a musician and an interpreter. One of the wonderful things about being on a college campus is that you have so many resources that also align with people's passions and interests. And so Blaise was able to have access to instruments and jam with music students and professors on our campus. This is a family from the DRC who have since moved to Tennessee. So even though families resettle in Greensboro, sometimes they actually move to another state. Finally, this is Ali. Well, we've hosted many families, but Ali is really interesting because, again, it speaks to the resources that campuses have. Ali is an artist and a calligraphist. And, a college campus has art departments and art supplies and art galleries. And so Ali was able to make use of a private studio and use art supplies from the art department and exhibit his work on our gallery. And it was picked up by a gallery downtown. This is some of his artwork. It's really beautiful. And he's now creating artwork on plates. If you're interested, let me know. You can commission pieces by him. 4 years ago, I developed a curricular component because I really wanted to institutionalize the effort. I wanted to make it unshakable, right, as part of the infrastructure of the college. And so I created 2 minors where students could actually get credit for doing this work, for hosting refugees on our campus. And so the 2 minors ran from 2017 to 2019, and then 2019 to 2021. And students take 4 courses in each minor. In one course, they learn about forced migration, displacement, refugeeism, why, how it happens. In another course, they learn to centralize the voices and experience and perspectives of refugees and immigrants. So they take literature classes, border crossing classes that focus on narrative. They take a course in community building and organizing to learn how to do this work in ways that are community-centered and community-based. And then finally, they take a course that's doing, right? It's the praxis course where they design projects, they host folks on our campus, they volunteer, direct service volunteering. And we also partner with Natakallam so students can have conversations with displaced individuals all over the world. Which brings me to my, one of the questions that you asked us to think about, Banu, is engaging ethically with refugees. And so the work that we do is really focused on centering the needs of the refugees that we host on our campus in ways that do not allow us to mine them as resources for our education. And so the folks that we host on our campus are not educational tools. We are there to do a job for them, which is to support them in their resettlement. We don't learn from them, right? They're not there to be our resource. And so we try to structure this learning through other avenues, especially through partners or agencies or published narratives by consent, or folks who are doing this work for pay, right? So through Natakallam. This is just a picture of me and my students sort of taking the bus downtown. Many students in that course had never taken public transportation. And so one of the ways we're trying to do this work is just to see what refugee resettlement looks like in Greensboro. And public transportation in Greensboro is tough. And so we wanted to make sure that students got to see what it means to be living in Greensboro as a refugee experiencing resettlement in this way. Let me see. I'm gonna stop here in talking about the minor and talk a little bit about, if I have time, Banu, I'm not sure if I do. I do. Just talk a little bit about the questions that you asked us to consider, especially what are some of the strategies that we can use to resist the racialization and marginalization of refugees, and for developing an appreciation for refugee experiences and knowledge and contributions. So I think one of the things that we need to do, and I think what ECAR does, is to resist the segregation of refugees when they come into the US. And it's a segregation that mimics the peripherization of refugees in refugee camps. So when refugees leave their country and they go elsewhere, they're in the periphery, right? They're in refugee camps that are on the borders, away from society. Even in urban refugee camps, they are peripherized and marginalized. And sometimes the refugee resettlement program in the US does that. It segregates them into communities in the US. And so I think one way that we can pursue the sort of to demarginalize refugees is to make sure that we focus on true integration efforts, true equal access to services, healthcare, employment, education, power, decision-making, which I think means improving the refugee resettlement program overall in the US in terms of its policies and practices and the ways in which our government can support refugees, but also an awareness on our part of refugee rights and continuing to advocate for policies that are anti-racist. For me, refugee work is anti-racist work, and working against racist systems that marginalize Black and Brown folks in this country is a way to work against the marginalization of refugees who are racialized in the same way that Black and Brown communities are racialized in the US. So I'll stop here, but I'm happy to address the other question when we get to it, hopefully with other folks on this committee, on this panel.
Thank you so much, Diya. Yeah, that was wonderful to learn more about it. And I hope we can also hear more about your new role and the center as well in the Q&A session. So our next speaker is Sandy Marshall, Dr. David J. Sandy Marshall, who is Assistant Professor of Geography at Elon University. His research focuses on the everyday space of children and youth whose lives have been impacted by conflict and displacement. Situated at the intersection of political and cultural geography, his work examines issues of trauma, memory, humanitarianism, and religion. Though the bulk of his work is situated in Palestine, he has worked with young people and refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Cyprus, South Africa, as well as refugees and migrants in the US. Having worked with youth organizations in the Middle East and refugee resettlement programs in the US, he has sought opportunities to engage with community-based organizations working with migrant and refugee populations in his undergraduate teaching and research mentoring, such as the Center for New North Carolinians in North Carolina and Ishkashita Refugee Network in Arizona. More recently, he has developed a partnership with the African American Cultural Arts and History Center in Alamance County, North Carolina, documenting and mapping other forms of displacement, namely the historic displacement of Black businesses from Burlington, North Carolina. Thanks a lot for joining us, Sandy.
Thanks so much for having me, Banu, and thanks to all the organizers of this wonderful series and for all the panelists today and letting me share some of my thoughts, experiences, and stories alongside all the wonderful work and projects you're doing. And please also excuse my lateness today. Had an issue with internet at home, but I'm here in my office now and it seems to be up and running. So apologies for that if I missed those comments at the beginning. Diya, you set up a wonderful segue for me because I really want to underscore a lot of the points that you're making about the marginalization and segregation of the refugee community within urban settings in the US, and how I'll be phrasing my comments and remarks today from the perspective of a undergraduate research or undergraduate teaching, predominantly undergraduate teaching and research institution. And the ways in which we sometimes reproduce the marginalization of refugees by treating them as a population that is apart, that is disconnected from broader urban communities and urban issues, as well as larger immigrant communities. So the theme of my comments today will be very much on this notion of unsettling borders and boundaries, not only boundaries between the campus and the community, but between the refugee community and other urban communities and immigrant communities, and how universities can play a role in creating networks of solidarity and support. So what I'd like to do is, again, very humbly share some of my experiences and lessons learned from good and bad choices I made with various attempts at community engagement, both in my research and teaching. So as Banu mentioned, I sort of gained an entryway into the complex and messy world of community-based research and teaching through my PhD research with children, Palestinian refugee children and youth living in the West Bank refugee camp of Balata. And in that work, I really sought to, first of all, first and foremost, center the voices and agency of Palestinian refugee children and youth themselves, and to push the limits of the narrative framings of their lives as either threats to the security of others or marginalized suffering victims, right? This kind of bifurcation of refugee subjectivity as either threatening or suffering. And to do that, I employed kind of participatory, visual, creative methods in my research, using mental mapping, using photo voice techniques, using digital story, and even drama and dramatic arts in terms of like producing short films that were written by refugee young people. And together we curated photo shows and photo exhibits in the camp, as well as short film festivals in the camp. And in doing this work, I also embedded my work with local community organizations, camp-based institutions, youth organizations, so that I was working alongside refugees and refugee young people in helping with the day-to-day activities of those centers, of helping with administrative and organizational duties, helping with report writing and things like that, as well as teaching. So really making sure that the research relationship was reciprocal. And that the young people themselves had a say in the products of that research, that it wasn't just directed towards and dedicated towards academic and scholarly outputs, but also creative outputs that were inspirational to them and to their community. I sought to use some of these techniques, which were frankly just really fulfilling, and both from a research perspective, and that they really give a rich understanding of everyday life and place and refugee camps beyond those dominant narratives, but also just kind of personally fulfilling. I tried to infuse that in my teaching when I returned back to the US and did a visiting assistant professorship at the University of Arizona. And this was in 2015, and as Diya mentioned, there was, many of us personally felt a commitment to wanting to create space for and stand in solidarity with refugees at a time of increased attention to refugee situation. But there's a tension here as well, in that so many universities were sort of rushing to this scene, and again, as Diya mentioned, kind of treating the refugee community as a resource, as a means by which universities can kind of check the box of saying, oh, okay, we're doing civic engagement and we're doing global education and intercultural learning. Isn't this wonderful? And so I saw a replication of some of the worst aspects we see of community service learning. And what I mean by that are, relationships that are not reciprocal, not transparent, but are instead episodic, celebratory, and that tend to reify rather than challenge power relations and dynamics, and that in some cases can actually, again, reproduce stereotypes rather than break them down. I first attempted to break beyond this mold by, rather than working with just individual refugee organizations, starting to seek out commonalities between different community groups. And in Tucson, Arizona, I did this through a undergraduate class called, it's an urban geography class on Metro Tucson. So this wasn't the partnerships I formed were not in the context of a kind of international migration studies course, but an urban geography course. And in this course, we formed a relationship, as Banu mentioned, with an organization called Ishkashita, which is a refugee support organization that takes the agricultural knowledge of refugees primarily from Iraq, Syria, and Somalia, and engages them in community gardening and gleaning. And this organization kind of came about because so many of the refugees from these regions were realizing that the foods that they're familiar with back home, whether it's date palms or pomegranates, were being grown in the Arizona Sonoran Desert, and yet the mostly white homeowners that were growing these fruits did so for ornamental purposes and not to actually eat or produce those foods. So these refugee communities were getting together to glean these food items, produce syrups and other products from them, and sell them to the local community. And so we engaged in that work. Our students were working alongside the refugees to harvest those foods. And in doing so, also learned about the histories of those foods and how they're used back in their home countries. At the same time, we formed a partnership with an organization called Tierra y Libertad, and this is a kind of a barrio sustainability organization that is similarly engaged in community empowerment through community gardening. And we learned about some of the histories and struggles of barrio communities of displacement. And so our students started to make connections between displacement of refugees and displacement of minoritized and racialized communities in the southwest city of Tucson. Other interesting connections emerged in that, again, so many of the foods that the refugees were gleaning and were using in their cooking had their origins in the Middle East, right? And so, and these were the same foods that were also being grown in older barrio communities and that had been brought by Spanish settlers going back centuries. So we're starting to kind of see these geographic connections between place and seeing refugees not as isolated communities, but as communities embedded in place that also have demands relating to public transportation, access to healthcare, public education, and many of the same issues that we're facing this barrio community. At the same time, we face the constraints that so many undergraduate service learning type courses have, and that we were confined to a semester. There were issues with, lack of transparency about expectations between the community partners and myself as an instructor and our students. And so I began to recognize the need to develop these relationships beyond the kind of semester to semester course kind of organizational structure, and again to form networks and partnerships. I'm grateful that despite the challenges of that partnership, we were able to get a grant for Ishkashita from the Arizona Humanities Foundation to produce a documentary called Taste Bud Memories, which again pairs the voices of refugees with members of the historic barrio, and looking at these histories and memories of food. And that short documentary was actually nominated for an Emmy, and so it raised a lot of attention for Ishkashita. And coming to North Carolina, I again brought in some of those experiences from Arizona, and was pleased to see at Elon University much more of a again an institutional support for this type of work, again which is so crucial, as Diya mentioned. We have in place a Kernodle Civic Engagement Center, which is very much dedicated towards supporting ongoing reciprocal community engagement, including with the Center for New North Carolinians. So I wasn't kind of going in there and forming my own relationships and institutional connections. Those were already being supported. And through our connection with the Center for New North Carolinians, students at Elon are able to offer tutoring support to refugee youth and volunteer in other ways. A lot of that's on hold now, given the current situation, but those institutional connections were there and we're building upon. And again, we're kind of creating a network of faculty at Elon who are interested in these issues, both from a research and teaching perspective, and infusing them in our courses. Here, though, again, because of the pressures that are sometimes placed on immigrant communities and refugee communities, I've kind of resisted forming any of those service learning opportunities within the structure of my course, and instead have tried to develop those relationships through our 2-year undergraduate mentoring opportunities here. So we've got a number of cohorted experiences for undergraduates to do long-term mentoring. And so I've worked with a number of students who have partnered either with local mosques or with the Center for New North Carolinians to conduct research with the local community, refugee and immigrant communities, in ways that, again, we hope are reciprocal, that they're feeding back the outputs of their research to those communities, and that they're engaged in ongoing weekly work, whether through volunteering or internships. So rather than trying to fit it within a course model, really having it as part of a long-term undergraduate research experience. And the final point I'll just make, kind of bringing it to the other institutional partnership that Banu had referenced. Alongside, so one of my undergraduate research students I'm mentoring is a multi-faith scholar. This is a two-year cohorted research experience, and she's embedding her research with the local mosque here. And alongside mentoring that work, I've also been engaged in work that with the African American Cultural Arts and History Museum, documenting the stories and mapping the stories and histories of displacement and marginalization of East Burlington and the formerly known as Black Bottom area of our city here, and the displacement of Black businesses. And much of that work has also been rooted in local Black churches. And we're starting to make connections between the mosque and those Black churches, and to share these kind of histories of migration and displacement, and hopefully creating new networks and lines of solidarity between these religious institutions, between these communities with disparate experiences of displacement, but starting to see how they all interweave within this narrative of place here in Burlington, North Carolina. So that work remains emergent and messy, but it's that kind of long-term relationship building that we're hoping to do with our course teaching and research mentoring. I think I'm probably out of time.
Thank you so much. Fascinating work in so many different places, Sandy. Yeah, we'll come back to these. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Meagan Clawar, who is the programs manager for Refugee Community Partnership, an organization that is located in Scarborough, North Carolina, really close to UNC. Founded in 2011, Refugee Community Partnership now involves the work of 400 plus members hailing from Burma, Syria, the Congo, and Mexico, and 200 plus advocates and more than 32 institutional partners. Meagan has been part of the RCP for 5 years. She received her Master's of Public Health degree at UNC after witnessing social determinants of health at play in every aspect of life for RCP members. As the program's manager, she negotiates language access at local institutions, partners with community leaders to ensure their voices and communities have a seat at the decision-making tables, implementing program evaluations strategies, and she also pursues partnerships with local organizations to create accessible programs and services that families request, all with an eye towards addressing social determinants of health. Thanks a lot for joining us, Meagan.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to be here. And I'm actually sitting about like 10 feet away from my colleague, Pawpaw, who I will let her introduce herself as well. And we'll split the time between the two of us.
Sounds great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Pawpaw.
So so we both work with Refugee Community Partnership, and I think it was kind of a perfect fit for the topic of this panel, because really at the core of RCP is building community and following community wisdom. So I can talk a little bit about how RCP was formed, which I think gives a good peek into kind of our philosophies and the way that the organization operates. So in 2012, the refugee community in Chapel Hill and Carrboro was growing. And at the time, the founders of RCP were working with another organization called the Human Rights Center, which was located within a neighborhood in Carrboro that was seeing a lot of refugee families arriving. And so kind of by proxy of being physically in that same space, they started to build relationships with local newly arrived refugee community members. And through those conversations, they were very informal. Like there was no agenda, there was no motivation behind it, aside from getting to know each other and just building relationships. And so over time, over a period of about 2 years, those folks started to have regular meetings and start talking about what were the needs that the community was seeing and what was lacking as far as support for refugee communities in the area. And so kind of two things came to the forefront out of those conversations. One was the social isolation and also geographic isolation that I believe Diya mentioned earlier, of that a lot of refugee communities are resettled in apartment complexes that don't often have very good access to bus routes, are kind of isolated physically from the rest of the community. Additionally, the language barrier created a huge isolation. And so in general, people were feeling just very isolated, and that was perpetuating kind of PTSD and other experiences of trauma that folks were still dealing with. And so they talked about how additionally the relationships people did have were with caseworkers who, because of the setup of the refugee resettlement program, were kind of tasked with very specific things that they needed to get done with families. And it left little room for relationship building. Kind of at the end of the day, as soon as the tasks were completed, the caseworker was off, to work with the next family. Understandably, they're very stretched for time. And so families were kind of feeling left in the lurch, and we're having a lot of difficulty rebuilding community and rebuilding social networks here in this area. The other issue that came up was kind of just addressing everyday needs. There were few community members who were fluent in English as well as at least one other of their native languages, most of the times more than one. And so those folks were kind of being the liaison for their community and doing this work unpaid and doing this work on top of working multiple jobs themselves to try to make ends meet. And so the group that kind of met together started talking about, okay, how can we address both of these things? And out of that Refugee Community Partnership, one of our main programs, Bridge Builders, which Papa now coordinates, and she'll talk a little bit about, that program was formed, as well as the organization, with the idea of working alongside refugee community members, following the needs and the desires of those community members, and just kind of serving as like a hub for any innovation, any programs, any ideas that the community has to advance their situation and what they're interested in. And so RCP prioritizes all of our funding, all of the decisions that we make are based on what we're hearing from community members, what community leaders within our organization are saying, and we kind of we're very nimble to be able to shift in those directions. One of the focuses, aside from the Bridge Builders program that came up, is language justice, and not just like simply being able to be provided with an interpreter, but also to have that access to language be in the hands of community members rather than them being kind of beholden to institutions, for the institutions to decide when they get access to language, when they're able to lodge a complaint, when they're able to apply for a program. And so RCP has started an interpreter bank that's based in the community, that's run by refugee community members. And community members are able to reach out to that interpreter bank directly and request interpretation. So they can say, I have an appointment and I know that, for example, a local hospital only provides telephonic interpreters, and I don't feel like that is adequate interpretation for me. I've been, abused by telephonic interpreters, or I've had interpreters that are not qualified interpreters. And so I want to exercise my own agency and bring my own interpreter along with me to either interpret or to just listen and confirm that the interpretation is accurate. And so that's, again, moving that power into the community's hands. And a lot of power does come through being able to communicate. And so language justice is one of our big areas of focus. We're kind of working on two ends, we're building a cooperative of young refugee interpreters who are excited to pursue this work and build up their skills. And then at the same time, working with local institutions to push them to actually pursue language justice beyond just, sometimes people stop at just access to interpreters, but we're moving beyond that to language justice and creating multilingual spaces and creating equity in that arena. And so that's a big part of our work. And Pawpaw, who is an amazing community leader, she brings an immense amount of experience navigating institutional barriers and working with community. She's running our Bridge Builders program, and I'll let her talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Yeah, so I'm Pawpaw, original from Burma, and refugees in Thailand, and settled here in 2006. And like Megan said, when I started here, there isn't any support for refugees with any kind of thing like resource or helping with language barrier for my family. So it was a big thing when RCP started, which is like, it's a huge help, and then put less stress on family who needed that support. So as a volunteer coordinator for Bridge Builder, matching out volunteer and family, most of our volunteer are UNC student, our community member, and our high school student who volunteer to work with families that parents can help with their kids with homework. So matching them up. So these are the volunteer that have voice for the family, and making sure helping the kids with the homework, making sure like they'll get their grades on top of the games, and then they're not behind with their class. And then parents will be the one then asking volunteer how the kids are doing, have they done the assignment, are they behind, because parent doesn't have that communication with their school because of language barrier. So basically the bridge builder will play a big role in the family's life, be the advocate for the family, just not in school, but also the family goals. For example, some families like, parents want to learn English, or they need it, they want to learn citizenship. So volunteer will get together and then with me to figure out, how do we want to teach our families to learn English? Is there like any kind of thing? For example, like, do we look for a class for them? Is there like online classes that where parents can participate in? And how do we ensure like, can we reach a goal by 6 months, by a year? Usually like for citizenship is usually like, we can't help the process, but we help them study. It can take up to a year to learn that. And then with English, it's a constantly a slow process, because English is hard for many people that never heard of English before. It take them a little while. And then, it does like take them a while, but like in the process of like our volunteer and family can start communicating with basic English with using a form of texting, body languages, or images. So having bridge builder, like I said, bridge builder play a big role in the family's life, especially the kids' educations, because with the kids' education, when parents can help with kids with homework during, especially with COVID, parents doesn't have that communication with the teacher. So I make sure that volunteer have open communication with the teachers. So like emailing, calling to make sure like what can the volunteer can help in order for the child to achieve in the class and not feel behind. And then parents does feel pressure when you don't have communication open with the teachers, and then not be able to be the language. It's just another stress over it. And yeah, basically just want to make sure when I'm matching up volunteer and then family, making sure like volunteer know what they're doing, and then we can meet the family's needs. Yeah, I think that pretty much suck up all the things that I do with them.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, Papa. And yeah, we're excited to contribute to the panel discussion afterwards as well and answer any questions then. Thank you all.
Great, thank you so much. Having 2 kids in schools, like I appreciate actually the difficulty of navigating the system, even as like someone who speaks English, right? Like it's just there's so many mysteries in that in those schools that I still do not understand most of the time what is happening and how to communicate with the teachers and the whole system. So yeah, sounds great. Thanks a lot. It was wonderful to learn more about RCP and its philosophy and how it's doing this work. Our last speaker is Lizzie Russler, who is a senior undergraduate student and a Moorhead Kane Scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to starting at North Carolina, Lizzie spent a year as an exchange student in Switzerland through Rotary's International Youth Exchange Program when Europe's so-called refugee crisis was unfolding in 2015. As a contemporary European studies major and a sustainability studies minor, Lizzie is interested in the intersection of human rights and climate change. Throughout her undergraduate career, Lizzie has worked with the Center for European Studies Working Group on Refugees, Europe and Service Learning. She also worked directly with urban refugees through a grassroots nonprofit, Hope of Children and Women, run by refugees for refugees in Kampala, Uganda. Thanks a lot for joining us, Lizzie.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be included on such a wonderful panel of people that are doing such inspiring work. So I'm excited to be here and I'm excited to contribute to the conversation. As Banu mentioned, I first became interested in migration topics as during my exchange year through Rotary International in Switzerland, because Switzerland is technically not in the EU, but a part of Schengen. That was a very contentious issue as we were watching the unfolding of Syrian civil war and what the implications were for Europe. And that sort of got me inspired to study international relations and sustainability, or not sustainability, sorry, but migration coming into UNC. And when I started at Carolina, I joined the working group on refugees, Europe, and service learning through the Center for European Studies. Sarah Hutchinson is actually also on this call, but she is in charge of this group, but it's so basically it's an informal space for students and sort of a student-run think tank around basically discussing the circumstances for refugees both in Europe and the US. We, similar to what Sandy was talking about with just the nature of the student experience, it's definitely hard to engage students in these topics because of the transitory nature of, you know, student going from the semester like jumps and the breaks, and then also whether they're taking semesters abroad. So really, this is just sort of a conversation group to discuss and bring into the conversation different practitioners that are working with refugees and on integration approaches. We've had people come from Church World Services for their refugee assistance programs, also the RCP, which is represented in this call, Transplanting Traditions, and then also different student volunteers that have volunteered in different capacities. And then also international photographers and filmmakers as well that have documented creatively like the different refugee experiences. This semester, obviously COVID has made it challenging to meet as a student group, but I have really appreciated and valued the learnings and experiences that I've had through Wrestle. And also, if you're interested in being involved as a student, I encourage you to go look on the Center for European Studies website and also reach out to Sarah. So after my freshman year, I went to Kampala, Uganda to spend the summer working with Hope of Children and Women, which is a small grassroots organization focused on integrating urban refugees into the community in Kampala. And basically they have three main focuses of job training programs, education, and healthcare. I mostly spent the summer documenting and rebuilding their website to help with grant funding and applications on that front. I was simply just having conversations with the people that were running the organization, hoping to get that communicated outwardly to help with their different projects with mostly European-based international organizations that were funding these sorts of projects that they were seeking out. And one of the projects was actually an agriculture collective that was aimed to build resiliency and also to establish food sovereignty within HOCW and its local communities. And through that experience, I witnessed how events related to climate change, like droughts and rising temperatures, obstructed market accessibility and inclusive economic opportunities, and sort of had that aha moment for me that climate change is essentially a vulnerability multiplier, and those who contribute the least are impacted the most. And I really do think coming after that experience, it sort of shaped the trajectory of what I've studied and where I would like to spend my career. And I think ultimately, you know, if you're having countries that have different refugee policies or immigration policies, and particularly ones that are becoming increasingly hostile to refugee groups and communities, I think climate change represents a huge threat to basically how we're going to integrate refugee communities and the openness to receiving refugee communities, especially as this becomes increasingly an issue. So after coming back from that experience, I've really focused a lot of my research and class studies on environmental justice issues, climate resiliency, climate migration, and particularly how the refugee definition doesn't capture climate and the impacts of climate. And climate, as we know from the Syrian civil war, is definitely a factor in some of these complex emergencies. And that's also the same that we saw, or that I saw from my experience in Uganda. But what about instances where you have in the South Pacific, where you have islands that are being impacted just by climate change and not by the threat of persecution? So that's sort of something that I have focused on in my research after that experience and throughout my undergraduate career. I probably offer more of the learning perspective on this panel than I do the actual work side, but I think that I have been very fulfilled by the classes that I've taken at Carolina and the mentorship that I have received through, for example, I took Dr. Niklaus Steiner's international migration and citizenship class. And then I'm currently in a humanitarian aid class, which that's my focus of the research is on climate migration. So I know that we're getting close to time, so I want to leave time for questions and answer and discussion. So thank you so much for having me and involving me on the panel, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Lizzie, and thanks for telling us more about climate change and how it's impacting also refugees as well. That's an important issue that we haven't talked about that much. So it was really great to hear you mention it and kind of foreground that discussion as well. I'm just going to close the session and with really, thanking our wonderful panelists who have, shared their experiences, and it's been really kind of enlightening to hear about the different kinds of work, and really heartening to hear about all this work that is going on with communities through different, at universities, in the communities themselves. So it's really encouraging and kind of gives me hope. So thank you. Thanks a lot for being here, for sharing your work, and telling us about the kind of questions that you have been dealing with. I also want to acknowledge our, wonderful audience, some of whom I've actually seen before, who've attended some of our sessions. It's really wonderful to see them and to have this kind of audience and interest in all the sessions that we have organized so far. And even though this is the last session that closes the conference, we are going to keep on working on these issues, and we would be really interested in staying connected to you, to everyone who has been participating, listening in. And our next steps will be breathe a little, kind of think about actually what we learned over these 5 weeks, which has been a lot, and then actually start to build a research platform focusing on this issue of unsettling borders, thinking about refugees. And we hope to, we have grand plans to connect researchers, do interviews with them, feature their research and different kinds of, community engagement activities, maybe develop lesson plans, do like citations, kind of like a bibliography. So we have all kinds of ideas, and if you are interested in participating or generating even more ideas, we'd really welcome you reaching out to us. Thank you so much to our panelists, to everyone who joined and participating and contributed to discussion. Thank you so much.